Well, good morning and happy Advent. As we continue the Advent pilgrimage, we continue to unpack the visitation and the beautiful exchange of love, the exchange of hearts, the exchange of words between Mary and Elizabeth. Yesterday we looked at how as Mary greeted Elizabeth, she began with her great Magnificat that her soul magnifies the Lord. There's also a key line in the Magnificat where Mary says that God has looked upon his handmaid's lowliness. That's Luke chapter 1 verse 48, that God has looked upon his handmaid's lowliness. Yesterday we talked about echo. We talked about how Mary's heart echoed back to God. You may remember our earlier meditation on empty, that as we look at Mary's virginity, it's most aptly understood with the word empty. And so you might say that Mary's empty led to her echo. There was nothing in Mary's heart that was not of God. Her heart was empty of anything that was not of God. And because her heart was empty, because it was free, she was able to echo back to God this perfect magnifying of his word. So empty leads to echo. And hold on to this. Oftentimes suffering leads to empty. Let me unpack that with you. Luke 1:48, Mary says that God has looked upon his handmaid's lowliness. What does that mean? What is that lowliness? Great book called Dawn of the Messiah. And in that book, the author, Edward Sri, reminds us that the original Greek word that's translated into the word lowliness is the Greek word tapision. And somewhat paraphrasing how Edward Sri defines that word tapision, he says that it's not just simply a humility, the lowliness that's there. The Greek word for that lowliness is not simply a humility, but it's a spiritual humility that's often caused by suffering. In fact, the word that's used there for lowliness, that Greek word, is often used in the Old Testament to depict an affliction of God's people when they were persecuted or oppressed, but at the same time about to be rescued by God. So for example, in Psalm 136, recalling how God once freed the chosen people from slavery, the psalm says, "It is he who remembered us in our lowliness, tapision, and rescued us from our foes." Another way to read Psalm 136 would be, "It is he who remembered us in our suffering and rescued us from our foes." So when we see in the Gospel of Luke that he has looked upon his handmaid's lowliness, it's easy for us to maybe understand that he has looked upon his handmaid's suffering. As a Jewish woman living in Israel 2,000 years ago, Mary would have been living in Israel during the occupation by the Romans. Mary would have lived amongst a people who were suffering under the rule of the Romans. Mary would have lived amongst the cry of a suffering people. Certainly Nazareth, where Mary lived, and all of Israel were crying out to God to save them from their suffering, to be with them in their suffering. In fact, if you look at the text of the Advent hymn, O come, Emmanuel. Look at verse 1. It says, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. Like Israel's enslaved. They are suffering. They are begging Emmanuel to be with them. Suffering's a part of life. And it's dismissed by our culture, but it pervades every person in the culture. A few of us embrace suffering, but every one of us faces it. Suffering's a part of life. And I think there's often a lie whispered deep within the suffering that, hey, we're alone. You know, when we're in the darkness, when we're in the suffering, it's easy for us to feel alone, to believe that we're alone. And I think a lot of us run from suffering because we want to run from abandonment more than we want to even run from the pain. And so if we presume that we're alone in the suffering, then we presume that we've been abandoned, and we don't want to go there, quote unquote, because a few of us like to face the fact that we are abandoned. So none of us wants to face suffering alone. And so, like, the beauty of Mary exclaiming, proclaiming, singing in her Magnificat that God has looked with favor upon her lowliness, that God has looked with favor upon her suffering. Mary knows God's fidelity. Mary knows Emmanuel, God with us, that God's going to be with us, even in the suffering. Mary knew Psalm 136, that the Israelites were soon rescued from their suffering. Mary knows that God's fidelity is real and that He is faithful even in our suffering. So she can remain empty. She can echo even in suffering because Mary knows who God is. Where are you suffering these days? And in that suffering, do you feel alone or abandoned? How's your echo in that suffering? Mary wants to be with you today, and I would encourage you to maybe ask Mary to join you, to be with you in your suffering. My friends, be not afraid. Let's trust the process. But let's be honest with our hearts today. Let the Lord in, especially into the places of our suffering. God bless you.